2 minutes and 22 seconds into the biggest football tournament ever staged, the broadcast cut away from the pitch. Not for an injury, not for a VAR review, for a commercial. And somewhere in Zurich, the organization that spent the last 3 years telling the world this would be the most pure, most fan-focused, most football-first World Cup in history, watched that cutaway happen exactly as it had quietly approved it to happen months ago in a memo most fans never saw. This is the story of how FIFA built a tournament around two contradictory promises, and how those promises collided in real time on the biggest stage the sport has ever had. To understand why this is happening, you have to go back to a policy FIFA has defended for over a decade. It's called the Clean Venue Policy. The idea is simple. During a FIFA tournament, no advertising appears inside the stadium except FIFA's own official partners. No local sponsors, no rival brands, no competing logos anywhere a camera might catch them. FIFA has enforced this so aggressively that for the 2026 World Cup, 10 of the 16 host stadiums were stripped of their actual corporate names for the tournament. AT&T Stadium in Arlington became, officially, Dallas Stadium. Just Dallas Stadium. As if the naming rights deal worth tens of millions of dollars simply didn't exist for 6 weeks. Only one stadium got an exception. Mercedes-Benz Stadium in Atlanta. Not because FIFA made an allowance out of goodwill, but because the building's retractable roof has an enormous Mercedes-Benz star embedded into its architecture. And after 18 months of discussions, FIFA's own engineers concluded that covering it without damaging the roof simply could not be done. 18 months to figure out how to hide a logo. That's how seriously FIFA treats the principle that nothing should compete with its official sponsors inside the stadium walls. So that's one FIFA. The FIFA that spent a year and a half negotiating the physical concealment of a car logo on a roof most fans will never look up to see. And then there's the other FIFA. Because in December of 2025, FIFA announced something that, on the surface, sounded like a player welfare initiative. Every match at the 2026 World Cup would include 2 mandatory 3-minute hydration breaks, one in each half, scheduled at the 22-minute mark, regardless of conditions. The official reasoning was heat. Several host cities sit in regions where summer temperatures climb into the high 90s and beyond. And FIFA framed this as a response to growing concern from medical experts and players about the risk of heat-related injury. Nobody disputes that the heat is real. During the 2025 Club World Cup, also played in the United States, multiple matches saw temperatures between 90 and 102 degrees Fahrenheit, with games delayed because of it. The concern was legitimate. The need was real. But here's where it gets complicated. Because FIFA didn't just schedule a break for players to drink water, it built that break into the broadcast structure. According to reporting from The Athletic, later confirmed by a FIFA spokesperson, broadcasters were given the green light to air commercials during those hydration breaks. Not as an afterthought, as part of the plan. Think about what that means. A World Cup match structured by FIFA itself now effectively has 4 quarters instead of 2 halves, with 2 of those breaks built specifically to accommodate advertising inventory. In the country the tournament was designed around, that's not an accident. That's the exact rhythm of American sports broadcasting, the rhythm of the NFL, where games are engineered around commercial pauses. FIFA didn't resist that model. FIFA adopted it, and dressed it in the language of player safety. So now you have 2 policies sitting next to each other. A policy so strict about advertising that it renamed 10 stadiums and spent 18 months arguing about a car logo on a roof. And a policy that built advertising breaks directly into the in-game structure of football itself, under the banner of hydration. One protects the visual purity of the broadcast from anything that isn't a FIFA partner. The other interrupts the match itself so FIFA's partners, and anyone buying time from Fox and NBC Universal, can run their spots. The contradiction isn't that FIFA allows advertising. Of course it does. The contradiction is what FIFA is willing to call advertising, and what it isn't. A local stadium sponsor's name on a wall? That's a threat to the integrity of the tournament, serious enough to justify renaming entire venues. A scheduled interruption to the match itself, built around a wellness justification? That's just smart scheduling. To understand how unusual this is, it helps to look at where football has come from. For most of the sport's history, the 90 minutes were sacred, in a way American sports never treated their game clocks. European leagues built entire broadcast economics around halftime as the only sanctioned pause. Advertisers bought time before kickoff, at halftime, and after the final whistle, and that was the deal. The match itself was untouchable. Even FIFA's own previous tournaments held to that structure. Brazil 2014 introduced cooling breaks in extreme heat, but those were exceptions, applied match by match, not built into the schedule as a permanent four-part structure with commercial slots attached. Qatar 2022, for all its controversies around heat, human rights, and infrastructure, did not restructure the actual rhythm of the 90 minutes to create standing advertising windows. What's happening in 2026 is different in kind, not just degree. It's the first time a World Cup has been engineered from the opening whistle around a broadcast model that treats the match itself as inventory to be divided. And it's happening at the exact moment FIFA is publicly increasing its control over every other form of in-stadium advertising to a degree never seen before. The players noticed first, because players are the ones whose rhythm gets broken. On May 20th, just weeks before the tournament opened, a letter organized by the New Weather Institute, signed by dozens of professional players, was sent to FIFA. The letter's headline concern was climate, calling on FIFA to strengthen its heat protocols and reduce the environmental footprint of the tournament. But buried inside that broader message was something more pointed. Players questioning whether the hydration breaks, as structured, were actually about player welfare at all, or whether welfare had become the framing device for something commercial. FIFA's response to the letter was, in essence, what FIFA's response always is when something inconvenient surfaces close to a tournament. Acknowledgement of the concern, reaffirmation of commitment to player health, no structural change. The break stayed, the ad slot stayed, the 22-minute mark stayed, fixed. Regardless of whether a match was being played in 70-degree evening conditions in Vancouver or 95-degree afternoon heat in Miami. If the policy were truly about heat, you'd expect it to flex with the conditions. It doesn't. It's locked at the same minute, every match, everywhere, which tells you the determining factor was never the thermometer. It was the broadcast clock. Now layer in the third piece of this, because this is where the story stops being about logos and commercials and becomes something much bigger, about who this tournament is actually built for. SoFi Stadium, one of the most expensive stadiums ever constructed, owned by Rams owner Stan Kroenke, confirmed as a host venue years ago. And yet, as the tournament approached, multiple people familiar with the situation told reporters that Kroenke's company had been locked in a financial standoff with FIFA. The dispute centers on exactly the kind of commercial arrangements we've been talking about. Who controls the advertising and sponsorship revenue generated inside these stadiums during the tournament, and who absorbs the cost of hosting? One source close to the situation put it bluntly. For most host cities, the financial terms are uncomfortable but survivable. For Los Angeles, the terms were described as close to existential. The language one insider used was that it was almost live or die. FIFA, an organization that enforces clean venue rules strict enough to rename 10 stadiums and spend 18 months negotiating a roof logo, was simultaneously in a dispute with one of its own host venues over who gets to profit from commercial access to that exact same space. This is not the first time FIFA has found itself in this exact position with a host city, and that history matters. Brazil 2014 produced years of protests over the billions spent on stadiums while public services went underfunded, with chants of "there won't be a cup" echoing through cities months before the opening match. Russia 2018 drew criticism over the gap between FIFA's revenue projections and the financial burden placed on host regions. Qatar 2022, despite being the most expensive World Cup ever staged, still generated disputes over which entities controlled commercial rights inside venues built specifically for the tournament. The pattern across every recent edition is the same. FIFA arrives, FIFA sets the commercial terms, and FIFA leaves with the revenue, while host cities are left negotiating, sometimes publicly, sometimes not, over what they're left holding. What makes the Los Angeles situation notable isn't that the dispute exists, it's that it surfaced this close to the tournament, and that the city in question is one of the largest media markets in the world, hosting matches that will be watched by hundreds of millions of people. If FIFA is willing to let a standoff with LA's host committee become public knowledge weeks before kickoff, it tells you something about how little leverage host cities actually have once they've signed on, and how confident FIFA is that the dispute won't affect the tournament's bottom line either way. So pull back and look at the full shape of this. FIFA controls with extraordinary precision what brands the cameras are allowed to see on a wall. FIFA controls down to the exact minute when the broadcast cuts away from the match for commercials, and frames that control as a health measure. And FIFA is in direct financial conflict with the people who own the buildings hosting all of this, over who gets paid for the commercial value FIFA itself is generating. Every layer of this story is the same story. It's about who controls the value created by football, and how that control gets justified to the public. The clean venue policy is framed as protecting the integrity of the tournament. The hydration breaks are framed as protecting the players. The disputes with host cities barely get framed at all because they're not meant to be public. But all three are about the same thing: the commercial architecture FIFA builds around the game, and FIFA's determination to control every part of that architecture, except the parts where it's financially inconvenient to do so. The media reaction to all of this has been split in a way that's worth noticing. Outlets covering the advertising and marketing side of the tournament, places tracking brand campaigns and sponsorship deals, have largely treated the hydration break ad slots as a logistics story, an interesting wrinkle on how broadcasters will monetize the tournament, no different in tone from reporting on a new halftime show or a sponsorship announcement. Meanwhile, outlets covering football culture and fan experience have framed the same decision very differently, as the Americanization of a sport that has spent over a century defining itself partly by what it refuses to become. Two different audiences, two different stories built from the same press release. Fan reaction has followed a similar split, but with a sharper edge. Longtime football audiences, particularly in Europe and South America, have reacted to the idea of scheduled in-match commercial breaks with the kind of disbelief usually reserved for rule changes to the offside law. For a sport that prides itself on the uninterrupted flow of 45-minute halves, anything resembling a timeout, especially one explicitly tied to advertising revenue, reads as a fundamental violation of what the game is. Social media discussion in the days following the December announcement repeatedly drew the same comparison: that FIFA had taken the one structural feature that distinguishes football from American sports, its refusal to pause for commerce, and quietly removed it, while calling it hydration. At the same time, there's been a smaller but notable strand of reaction from fans based in the host countries, particularly the United States, who see the change as a practical accommodation rather than a betrayal. For audiences raised on sports built around commercial breaks, a structured pause every 22 minutes isn't an imposition. It's simply how television works. That divide between fans who see the change as sacrilege and fans who see it as normal is itself a preview of the larger cultural negotiation this World Cup represents. A tournament built across three countries, two of which have deep football cultures built on uninterrupted play, and one of which has never watched sport any other way. FIFA's institutional response to all of this, across every thread, has followed the same pattern you'll find throughout this tournament's build-up. Nobody can credibly oppose player hydration. Nobody can credibly argue stadiums shouldn't have rules about advertising. The criticism only becomes visible when you place the policies next to each other, which is exactly what almost never happens in the day-to-day coverage of a tournament this size, where each story arrives separately, on its own day, framed on its own terms. The long-term consequences of this moment may not be visible for years, but they're worth naming now, because tournaments set precedents, and precedents are sticky. If the hydration break commercial structure works financially in 2026, meaning broadcasters see strong ad performance during those windows and host nations don't revolt against the format, there is no reason to expect FIFA to abandon it for future tournaments. The 2030 World Cup, already confirmed to be split across 6 countries on 3 continents, and the expanded Club World Cup format that debuted in 2025, both represent opportunities for FIFA to expand a model that originated as a heat safety measure into a permanent feature of how football is broadcast globally. Once a sport changes its relationship with time, with what's allowed to interrupt play, it rarely changes back. There's a wider implication here too, beyond FIFA specifically. Football has always positioned itself as commercially different from American sports, slower to monetize the actual flow of the game, more protective of the 90 minutes as a kind of shared, uninterrupted ritual. Sponsorship lived around the match, on shirts, on boards, on broadcast graphics, but rarely inside the match's own rhythm. What's happening in 2026 is a test of whether that distinction was a structural feature of the sport or simply a historical accident of where football happened to be popular. If the world's biggest football tournament can be restructured around commercial breaks without meaningful resistance from federations, players' unions, or fans, the door is open for domestic leagues, particularly those competing for American broadcast revenue, to follow the same path. The Premier League, La Liga, and other major competitions have all, at various points, discussed mid-match advertising opportunities as a revenue lever. A successful 2026 World Cup, successful in commercial terms, gives every one of those conversations new momentum. So here's what's worth sitting with as these matches continue. Every time the broadcast cuts to commercial at the 22-minute mark, ask yourself whether that break is really about a player's hydration or about a slot Fox and NBC Universal sold months ago. And every time you see a stadium with its real name quietly replaced by a generic geographic label, ask what exactly FIFA is protecting and from whom? The LA standoff, the ad breaks, the clean venue contradictions stay background noise for this tournament? Or do you think, as the stakes rise through the knockout stages and the audience numbers climb into the billions, one of these stories breaks into the foreground the way the empty seats did on day one? And if the hydration break ad model succeeds commercially in 2026, do you think football ever goes back to 90 minutes that belong only to the game?